At 81, Willie Nelson reached a moment no one ever expected. After a lifetime spent chasing highways and bright stages, he suddenly stepped back, leaving fans wondering what happened to the man who once swore he'd never slow down. For decades, Willie seemed untouchable, outrunning age, pain, and the countless storms that followed him through his career. But behind that familiar smile was a truth he kept buried for years, a truth he finally let slip when the spotlight grew dim and the noise around him faded. And when he finally spoke about why he pulled away, it wasn't the reason people assumed. It wasn't about fame, money, or even the long miles of touring. It was something far deeper, something he had carried for most of his life, but never had the courage to admit out loud. What made Willie's silence even more unsettling was how suddenly everything changed. For a man who lived his entire life in motion, the pause felt louder than any announcement ever could. Fans first noticed it when tour dates quietly disappeared from schedules. No dramatic statements, no final farewell, just a slow fading of the constant travel that had defined him for more than half a century. And while people tried to convince themselves he just needed a break, something about the shift didn't feel temporary. Willie had endured pneumonia scares, breathing issues, and the heavy aches of age before. Yet he always seemed to bounce back with that same stubborn fire in his eyes. This time, though, there was no triumphant return, and that silence opened the door to uncertainty. Rumors began circulating in fan groups, interviews, and small-town whispers. Some wondered if it was the toll of aging finally catching him. Others suggested he might be facing private health concerns he wasn't ready to share. A few online discussions even floated the idea that Willie simply didn't want to risk another onstage scare, the kind that had shaken him in the past. But even these theories felt incomplete. The truth is, Willie had always been larger than those assumptions. He'd survived financial disasters, emotional heartbreaks, and enough industry pressure to crush most careers. So stepping away so quietly didn't match the man the world had known for decades. If anything, it hinted at something far more personal, something deeper than the surface explanations people were trying to piece together. And as more time passed, it became clear that the slowdown wasn't just a matter of age catching up. It was tied to a hidden struggle that had been building behind the scenes, one that almost no one saw coming. But the first real clues didn't show themselves until another part of Willie's life began unraveling. That unraveling started with the one thing Willie never liked talking about: his health. For years, he brushed off concerns with a quick joke or a shake of his head, insisting he'd outlive half the people worrying about him. But people close to him saw the signs, even when he tried to hide them. Those recurring breathing issues he battled, the bouts of pneumonia that came back harder each time, the exhaustion that lingered longer than it used to, none of it went unnoticed. And while Willie pushed forward with his usual grit, the people around him began to realize the road wasn't just tiring him out, it was wearing him down. Crew members whispered about moments he struggled backstage, catching his breath before facing a crowd that expected the same unstoppable legend they'd always known. Friends worried when he canceled appearances that he normally would have fought through. And although no official statements came from his team, the silence only fueled more speculation. Some fans claimed they heard he'd been advised to slow down by doctors. Others believed he simply couldn't handle the physical strain anymore. But the truth remained hidden, covered by Willie's lifelong habit of keeping the toughest parts of his reality to himself. Yet behind closed doors, those closest to him were growing more concerned than ever. Even his family, known for respecting his independence, supposedly urged him to step back before the lifestyle he'd embraced for decades pushed him beyond his limits. And while these conversations were never made public, people familiar with the situation hinted that the pressure was growing. But despite all the health talk and whispers swirling around him, Willie's final reason for stepping away had far more to do with an emotional wound than any physical struggle. Something deeper was pulling him inward, and it all started with a loss he never truly recovered from. That loss came when Willie's sister Bobby Nelson passed away, an event that hit him harder than most people realized. Bobby wasn't just his sister. She was his musical partner, his lifelong supporter, and one of the few people who truly understood the battles he carried quietly. They'd played together since childhood, sharing piano benches long before they ever shared concert stages. She was the calming presence behind his whirlwind life, the steady voice that kept him grounded when fame tried to pull him in every direction. When she passed, something in Willie shifted. Those close to him noticed the change immediately. The man who once treated the road like his true home suddenly seemed lost on it. Performances that once brought him joy felt heavier. Audiences still saw the legend, but those who knew him saw the sadness he tried so hard to mask. And even though he tried returning to the stage after her death, it was clear something was missing, not just musically, but emotionally. He spoke in interviews about how much Bobby meant to him, but there were deeper truths he didn't share on camera. Rumors suggest he confided in friends that playing without her felt like stepping into an empty room. Others claim he said that every note reminded him of the years they spent side by side. Whether these stories are fully accurate or not, one thing was obvious. Her absence changed him profoundly. Grief has a way of slowing even the strongest among us, and for Willie, it seemed to blur the once clear lines between duty and desire. The spotlight didn't feel worn anymore. The applause didn't fill the space her presence used to. And the long stretches of silence between shows gave him more time than ever to reflect on what and who he'd lost. But as heavy as this grief was, it was just one part of the truth. Because losing Bobby forced Willie to confront something he'd avoided for decades. The regrets he'd tucked away while chasing the life the world expected from him. Those regrets had been building slowly, tucked behind every tour bus window and hotel room door. For most of his life, Willie lived at a pace few could keep up with. The constant traveling, the late nights, the endless shows. He built an empire on speed and grit. But only when the world grew quiet did he begin realizing how much he lost along the way. He talked once about missing milestones with his children, about sacrificing personal moments because the road was calling. And while he didn't dwell on it publicly, people close to him said these thoughts weighed heavier as he aged. Longtime friends have hinted that he worried about how much of his life slipped by while he was chasing the next venue. Fans online often speculate that Willie privately admitted he didn't want to lose more time with the people he still had. And though no one knows exactly what those private conversations sounded like, the shift in his behavior spoke louder than any quote could. He began choosing quiet mornings over long drives, conversations with family over rehearsals, and home-cooked meals over rushing to the next city. These weren't decisions made out of weakness. They were choices shaped by a lifetime of pressure. Willie had always carried the burden of being the icon, the man who never slows down. But now, he finally seemed ready to question that identity, ready to choose himself, even if it meant stepping away from the one thing that defined him. Still, Despite all these emotional turning points, the most surprising reason behind his retreat was tied not just to the past, but to a future he wasn't sure he wanted to face. Because the closer he looked at where his life was heading, the more he realized there was another force pushing him away from the spotlight. But even as Willie tried to face the emotional weight of age and the regrets he carried, there was another force pushing him away from the life he'd known. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't just exhaustion. It was the pressure that had quietly followed him for decades. People often forget that Willie's career wasn't built on comfort. Behind the scenes, he'd been fighting battles most fans never saw. From financial trouble to personal expectations that never seemed to end. The most infamous moment came when the IRS seized nearly everything he owned. Properties, possessions, even recordings. Forcing him to rebuild from the ground up. That alone would have broken most artists. Yet Willie didn't crumble. He wrote, recorded, and toured with a determination that almost didn't seem human. But even after he cleared his debts, the lifestyle surrounding him never really changed. The industry kept demanding more. The schedules grew heavier, and the unspoken expectation was that Willie would always be available, always performing, always pushing forward. And while he handled that pressure with a smile, it came at a cost. People close to him have quietly mentioned that Willie felt trapped by his own reputation. This image of a road warrior who could outwork anyone. Rumors claim he wanted to escape the endless cycle of rehearsals, meetings, promotional pushes, and multi-state tours. Some insiders even said he disagreed with industry people who kept pressing him to keep touring, knowing his name alone could fill stadiums. That tension didn't explode publicly. It simmered quietly behind layers of professionalism and respect. But the moment Willie began stepping away from the spotlight, the truth slipped through the cracks. He didn't want to live the rest of his life fighting obligations created decades before. He wanted to breathe, really breathe, for the first time in years. But even this wasn't the final reveal, because when Willie finally opened up at 81, what he shared wasn't about pressure or pain. It was about a truth he'd kept buried deep within, a confession that changed everything the world assumed about why he walked away. That confession came quietly, in a moment so unassuming that many fans almost missed it. Willie didn't sit down for a dramatic interview. He didn't prepare a speech or make an announcement. Instead, he spoke the truth the same way he always lived. Honest, unfiltered, and without worrying how the world might interpret it. He admitted that he no longer wanted to be remembered primarily for the tours, the miles, or the stages. He said he wanted his final years to be spent living, not performing. It was a simple line, but behind it was a lifetime of hidden meaning. Willie had given the world thousands of shows, countless albums, and memories that stretched across generations. But somewhere along the way, the music became tied to expectations. The spotlight became a weight, and the road became something he felt obligated to carry. His confession revealed that he'd been thinking about legacy. Not the kind made of awards and headlines, but the type built through peace, connection, and authenticity. Some reports claim he told a close friend that he didn't want to collapse on a stage someday, in front of thousands of people. Whether that sentence is perfectly accurate or just fan speculation, it struck a chord online because it sounded like something Willie would say. It reflected a man who had finally made peace with slowing down, even if the world still wanted him to speed up. And with this confession came another surprising revelation. He was ready to shift his focus from performing to creating. He wanted to write more, reflect more, and shape the final chapters of his life with intention. Not for the industry, not for the crowd, but for himself and for the people he cared about most. Yet even this wasn't the end of the story. Because once Willie acknowledged this truth, he began looking at his legacy in a way he never had before. As Willie settled into this new chapter of his life, his attention turned to something he'd long avoided: how the world would remember him after he was gone. For decades, he let the music speak for itself. He'd never chased legacy, he simply lived. But now, with time feeling more precious than ever, he wanted to protect the story he'd spent 8 decades building. People around him started noticing the small shifts. He became more selective about the projects he accepted. He turned down opportunities that once would have been automatic yeses. He spent more time writing, more time with family, and more time looking inward instead of outward. Fans even speculated that he was preparing one final body of work that would capture what he truly wanted to say, something deeper than the songs he wrote on the road. There were also whispers online that Willie clashed privately with individuals who wanted him to keep performing, arguing that his legacy needed constant visibility. But Willie seemed to understand something they didn't. Sometimes stepping back is the only way to preserve the magic. The legend of Willie Nelson wasn't built by overexposure or constant headlines. It was built through authenticity. And he wasn't about to let the latter years of his life be shaped by pressure or expectation. Instead, he focused on the connections that mattered: family, friends, the handful of people who knew the man behind the music. And slowly, it became clear that stepping out of the spotlight wasn't an ending. It was a choice to protect everything he'd worked for. But the most powerful part of this journey wasn't about slowing down or stepping away. It was about the realization that the spotlight, for the first time in his life, no longer defined him. In the end, Willie Nelson didn't retreat from the spotlight because of a single moment, illness, or headline. His decision was shaped by a lifetime of experiences: grief, regrets, pressure, reflection, and a quiet understanding that the time he had left deserved something more than exhaustion and obligation. When he finally spoke openly at 81, he revealed a truth far more human than dramatic. He stepped away because he wanted to live on his own terms, not the industry's. The world may remember him as the outlaw, the road warrior, the unstoppable legend. But Willie, in his own heart, wanted the world to see the man behind all of that. The brother who mourned deeply, the father who longed for more time, the artist who still had stories to tell, and the soul who finally chose peace over performance. And maybe that's the greatest confession of all. After a lifetime of giving everything to the world, Willie Nelson finally gave something back to himself.